Okay, assalamu alaikum. Welcome everybody to the first e-circle in quite a while. I think the format's slightly different, so I'm just trying to get used to the way it looks now. But that's fine. Brilliant, alhamdulillah. Very nice to see you all. I hope you've had a wonderful Ramadan. I know it was very different, of course, but I think certainly for myself, it was very different, but actually quite energizing because we were forced to treat it in a different way as well, and in some ways, a lot more focus. I'm sure you also found on personal ibadah rather than kind of doing things collectively, and that in itself can have a benefit. And as we as Muslims, we believe that there is reason to be thankful to Allah in every situation. Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Innal hamdulillah. Innal hamdulillah. Indeed, all praise, all thanks is due to Allah. Wassalatu wassalamu ala Rasulillah. And peace and blessings be upon his final messenger, his beloved, our Prophet, Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wasallam. Right, so let me start by sharing the screen. So I'll start with a little reflection. I was reading, I was concentrating this Ramadan on the sort of latter portion of the Quran. And, we're all familiar with the beautiful Surah Rahman, which, like a lot of people's favorite surah. And, what's really beautiful about it, amongst many things, is that it describes Jannah in a very vivid way. And, it's dazzling. It's so utterly attractive. And the interesting thing is that kind of halfway through this description, and everything's done in dual, as you know, in Surah Rahman. And the reason for that is because it's talking about ins and jinn. Ya ma'shar al-insi wal jinni. The people of the jinn and mankind. So whenever it talks about two jannahs, it's talking about a type of jannah for men and a type of jannah for ins, for jinn, because I guess they like different things, right? So if you're appealing to jinn, perhaps their kind of jannah would be slightly different. Allahu alam. Okay. But interestingly, at some point, so through Surah Rahman, Allah says, وَمِن دُونِهِمَا جَنَّتَانِ. So you get this amazing description of Jannah, but it's actually described as in the dual. And then it says, and وَمِن دُونِهِمَا, and other than these two Jannahs are Jannatan, another two Jannahs. And description is of like, wow, something even more. And, it doesn't actually say how you get there or anything. But it does say in Surah Rahman, هَلْ جَزَاءُ الْإِحْسَانِ إِلَّا الْإِحْسَانِ. Can the reward for excellence be anything but excellent? Yeah, subhanallah, an amazing verse. And, maybe this is a verse that we should play in our mind all the time, constantly remembering that, هَلْ جَزَاءُ الْإِحْسَانِ إِلَّا الْإِحْسَانِ. If I'm going to put the extra labor in, inshallah, I'm going to expect some excellent reward for that in time to come. So the next surah, Surah 56, Surah Waqi'ah, which is, the Waqi'ah is kind of the event, right? And it talks about the Day of Judgment. And it talks about how humanity is split into three categories on the Day of Judgment. So you have the companions of the left hand and the companions of the right hand. And you can kind of understand, you can imagine who they are, right? Or what category of people they are. But then it says, وَالسَّابِقُونَ السَّابِقُونَ. And there's a third category. And Allah explains that the foremost will be foremost. So it's a bit like, هَلْ جَزَاءُ الْإِحْسَانِ إِلَّا الْإِحْسَانِ. You do excellence and your reward is excellence, right? So in that verse, it says, you are foremost, you will be foremost, right? The foremost will be foremost. And it talks about how people will be in, in tremendous terror that day and suffering, and there will be people who will have light shining in front of them, and they will be able to hurry across the Sirat into Jannah. So it's quite a gripping description, actually. And then the next surah after that has this lovely verse, a Surah Hadith, about iron. But in that, there is this verse, which again uses the verb form of a sabiqun. So sabiqun is a noun, and the verb is sabiqu. And the verse goes, sabiqu ila maghfiratin min rabbikum, jannatin arduha ka'ardi samawati wal ard. أعدت الذين آمنوا بالله ورسوله ذلك فضل الله يؤتيه من يشاء والله ذو الفضل العظيم. Beautiful ayah, subhanallah. And again, this verse uses that thing about go the utmost. It says, سابقوا إلى مغفرة من ربكم وجنة. So rush forward, be the foremost towards getting the forgiveness of your Lord, and a garden, right? أرضها كأرض السماوات والأرض. A garden whose width is like the width of the heavens and the earth. And in the end it says, ذلك فضل الله يؤتيه من يشاء, that this is a gift, you might say, from Allah, a bounty from Allah that he gives to whoever he wishes. And then ends with Wallahu dhul fadl al-azim, that Allah is the possessor of the most tremendous bounty. Yeah. And in some ways, at the time of the Prophet, people could have somewhat imagined that and understood it. But I think now, maybe we can't imagine it, but we can understand it a little bit better. That if you think that, wow, seriously, each person getting each one of how many billion people have there ever been in the world? But okay, let's say the ones who are the Sabiqun, okay, they will get no ordinary Jannah. They will get something whose width is like the heavens and the earth. And you think, really, how could that be possible? But now we know that the stars in the sky are not just ornaments, and the stars in the sky are only the ones that we can see in our galaxy, the Milky Way. But how many countless galaxies are there out there in our universe? And even the stars we see are only a fraction of the stars in even our own Milky Way. Subhanallah. So, for us to be granted by Allah, even a solar system is easy for Allah. Yeah, he who possesses, he who originated, created, and the master of this entire phenomenally vast dominion, what is it to him to give each person even just a solar system? And subhanallah, there's a hadith in which I think this is an authentic hadith, that at one time the companions will or the people in Jannah will long for each other, right? They'll say, what about so and so? It would be nice to go and visit them, and a couch will be brought to them, and on that they can travel to the Jannah of their old friends, and there will be a conversation there, and they will say, remember that time when we sat together, we basically did ibadah, and we asked Allah's forgiveness, and he forgave us, as in like, and here we are now as a consequence of that event. SubhanAllah. But it just makes you think that, each person will be in a place that could be so vastly separate and distant from the other person, that they will need some kind of fancy traveling couch, spaceship or whatever, to go and travel there. SubhanAllah. It's hard to even imagine what, we could, we can only just get sort of a vague notion of what could be there for us. So, let us all try to be a sabiqun. MashaAllah, I know that, in campus, so many young people are devoting themselves in the service of the Creator. And inshallah, you are sabiqun. May Allah help us all to be a sabiqun. And the way I see it, how do you become a sabiqun? Essentially, what you're talking about is doing something a little bit above and beyond the bare minimum. Yeah, like how the Bedouin said, Ya Rasulullah, what's the least I have to do? And he said, the 5 pillars. And he said, well, I swear by Allah, I'm not going to do any more than that. And the Prophet, as he left, the Prophet said, if he's true, then he'll succeed. I can't remember the exact details of it, but so that's kind of ordinary Jannah. But to get the ultimate, you have to be sabiqun. Yeah, the sabiqun will be sabiqun. So let's go that bit further, and the things that are about that are, I think, as related in the Quran time and again. You look at the commandment verses that the Quran, we've been through those before. It becomes very clear what really pushes you towards a sabiqun and is more than just doing ordinary stuff. That is fundamentally connecting to Allah. Okay, so this is about going further in your ibadat, to be thinking about Allah regularly, doing extra dhikr, stopping, maybe appreciating beauty and just saying La ilaha illallah, subhanallah, saying alhamdulillah. But it's not just reciting it, but this means like feeling it in your heart, right? Having that constant relationship with God, reading extra Quran, all of that, because Allah said, Wala dhikrullahi akbar, that the greatest of all things are remembered, because fundamentally that's what we're here for, right? Secondly is about character, having that gentleness, having that kind of tenderness towards other people, trying to build relationships with other people, bring communities together, bring hearts together, joining hearts. This is replete in the Quran about doing this, being people of peace, making peace between parties, right? Thirdly, khidmah, and this is caring for people, but also caring about people, which means standing up for justice where there's an injustice, feeling it in your heart, being really pained by it, being agitated by it, and wanting to do something and physically doing something, whether it be with your hands or with your tongue, and then finally is learning and teaching. Now, you could say that the learning and teaching of religious knowledge, and also bringing people to God who maybe have disconnected from God, but also all knowledge that is of benefit to man is part of that process, I think. So inshallah, may Allah make us people who travel these paths, inshallah, in whatever form, and dedicate our lives to that. And remember forever this ayah of the Quran, Hal jaza'ul ihsani illa al-ihsan. Can the reward for excellence be anything but excellent? Inshallah. Right, let's start now with our presentation for today. So, as you know, last term, I used to spend a lot of time revising the previous talk because everything built on the other. In some ways, we will be putting that aside, but it's still connected. So the overall theme of what we've been studying in previous weeks, months really, has been tajdeed, which is revivalism, because there's a hadith in which the Prophet said, at the head of every century, Allah will send those who will revive the religion. Okay. So, what is revival of the religion? And we went through the details of how you could define tajdeed. Fundamentally, it is about looking at the challenges of the time, looking at how maybe the religion or people are being challenged, finding particularly ways of safeguarding the religion or safeguarding the people of the religion. And so, doing something that may seem a little bit creative, a bit different to before, but fundamentally, it's actually maintaining the integrity of the religion. So last time we were talking about the Imams of the Sunnah, because the first thing after the Quran was preserved very early on. We know that it was preserved straight away after the Prophet passed away and turned into a book. Before that, it was called the book, and people knew about it from beginning to end, but it wasn't collected in the book. Okay, but the next thing after that was knowing the Sunnah of the Prophet. So the Imams of the Madhahib were primarily concerned with preserving the Sunnah, which is the teachings of the Prophet. How do you live your life in the example, in the mold of the Prophet ﷺ? And there were different perspectives on how you define Sunnah. And, you know, Imam Malik understood Sunnah as, okay, this is the practice of the people, the city of the Prophet, where, you know, 10,000 companions remained, and all of their students and their students after them and their students until you came to Imam Malik. And so surely what people as a consensus are practicing in Medina has got to be the way of life taught by the Prophet, because he wasn't a minority. Muslims were not a minority in Medina. Medina was the city that was, you know, brought to life by the Prophet ﷺ and lived in his mold. And, you know, there were other interpretations as well, and we've talked about that. Imam Shafi came along and said, well, look, you know, there are so many different perspectives. Surely the Sunnah is actually the Hadith. If you have a saying of the Prophet ﷺ reliably transmitted, and Imam Shafi, you know, wrote in his books about how to, you know, assess hadith, and if there seems to be a contradiction in different hadith, how to kind of to resolve the contradiction or apparent contradiction, etc. But rely primarily on hadith. Okay, so our discussion this term is going to be, and then we went last term about, okay, you know, now that we've got an idea of the Sunnah and an idea of madhabs, how do you choose between them? What if there seems to be a conflict between the overall Sunnah and some hadith that seem to be completely difficult to reconcile, doesn't seem to be the way the Prophet would act? And we know that Imams would sometimes park hadith, and we looked at times where there was that kind of contradiction and how it's caused problems for us today as well. So we did that. Then we talked about Imams, choosing a madhab and how to find which scholar to follow. Do you need to follow scholars? What are the benefits of scholars, etc.? And I have been promising the notes for that talk, and I'll hand it over soon, inshallah. Just got to finish up the bibliography, then I'll hand it over, inshallah. Okay, so now we are going to proceed to, you know how we were talking about this sort of conflict sometimes between Sunnah and Hadith. What I deliberately evaded was a question about the authenticity of the Hadith. So the examples I brought forward were Hadith that are already considered reliable and authentic, you know, but they seem to contradict what we'd understand to be the Sunnah or principles in the Quran sometimes as well. Because that's a different discussion altogether about authenticity. And this is the discussion we're going to get into now, inshallah. Okay, so the question that we're going to look at today is, okay, what are hadith and where did they come from? How can we trust them? You know, it's all very well saying, okay, you're talking about authentic hadith. How do you know they're authentic? Prove it to me, you know? And people will ask you that question, and we should be able to answer that ourselves. You know, in our own hearts, we've got to have that kind of sense of assurance that, you know, we can find the Prophet. You know, the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam has not been lost to the mist of time. Okay, he is still preserved in the finest details of his life, inshallah. But you know, how do you reassure yourself of that? And that's what we're going to be answering the question of, because of course, you know, fundamentally, we talked about this last time as well, that as Muslims, the Sunnah is crucial. The Quran gives lots of details, it gives amazing principles, but if you want to find the exact way of, or you know, of living the light of the Quran, then that will be in the example of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Yeah. لَقَدْ كَانَ فِي رَسُولِ اللَّهِ أُسْوَةٌ حَسَنَةٌ, that you will have for sure in the messenger of Allah an excellent example. So where do we find it? How do we find that example if it's not in the Quran? The Quran has a few little things about the Prophet. Often it probably has a lot more about other prophets than it has about the Prophet Muhammad SAW in the Quran. So where are we going to find that? It has to be in the Hadith, right? And we're going to feel a little bit bereft if somebody told us that, oh, all the Hadith are unreliable, made up, because that means that we've lost our Prophet. Do you see? So in order for you to have a connection and to be able to hold on to the memory of the Prophet and the way of the Prophet, you have to have some reliable accounts of him. This is the issue we're going to be discussing. So Imam Bukhari, for instance, and it's the most famous book of Hadith, he was born 194 Hijrah, which is 184 years after the Prophet. So literally, we're talking about 200 years after the Prophet passed away, that the kind of most famous collection of Hadith is being written. So people have leveled the charge. And you will see it written many times before, that for 200 years, there was no written record of what the Prophet, who the Prophet was, what he said, what he did. But it actually emerged to the point that some people go so far, and it's really an extreme and bizarre opinion, to be honest. And it kind of annoys me that a person with any amount of credibility should hold this opinion, that Muhammad may not even have existed, and that everything about the Prophet, including the Quran and everything, was all made retro and fitted into this character was created, concocted, fictional character, and then everything is elaborate story, the religious book and all the Hadith were all made up after him. Which is bizarre, but this is this opinion. Well, we'll talk about it another time, shall anyway. Right. So that's the kind of allegation, and you might think, well, where are the written records of anything else before that? Maybe it's true. Maybe the first time anything about the Prophet was written was in Bukhari. Maybe he just made it all up. Let's have a look at a contrast, let's say, to what we have in Islam. So if you look at the Gospel of Matthew, you have these verses where it says that, and when they climbed into the boat, the wind died down. Then those who were in the boat worshipped him, saying, "Truly, you are the Son of God." And later in Matthew it says, so the women hurried away. This is the after the supposed resurrection. So the women hurried away from the tomb, afraid yet filled with joy, and ran to tell the disciples. Suddenly Jesus met them. "Greetings," he said. They came to him, clasped his feet, and worshipped him. So obviously we would have issues with these verses. Christians will take that literally, and they will see that as authentic, many of them. Okay, but we would probably say, nah, not authentic. Sure, this wouldn't have happened. Jesus wouldn't have allowed people to hold onto his feet and worship him. This has got to be made up later. Okay, now whichever argument you have, the problem is that there isn't any really sound authoritative evidence one way or the other. Okay, somebody said stuff about Jesus, they wrote it down, and we have it here today in the Gospels. So that's the situation with the Bible. What about Hadith? So for instance, this Hadith here, where Umar ibn al-Khattab said that I heard the Messenger of Allah sallallahu alaihi wasallam saying actions are according to intentions. The famous Hadith, first Hadith of Imam Nawawi's collection, etc., collected by Bukhari and Muslim. Now, do you believe that one? Presumably you do. Okay. so, why the contrast? Why would we believe this one? And it's the sayings about a prophet, and we wouldn't would reject maybe what was said about Jesus in Matthew, alayhi salam. Okay, what about this hadith of the prophet, where the prophet says that Allah says, I was a hidden treasure and I wished to be known, so I created a creation, i.e. mankind, then made myself known to known to them, and they recognized me. So I think it's very nice. It's a lovely notion that Allah wanted to be known, so He made mankind so that they could recognize Him. And there is the ayah in the Quran, وَمَا خَلَقْتُ الْجِنَّ وَالْإِنسَ إِلَّا لِيَعْبُدُونَ, that I haven't created men and jinn except to worship me. So, okay, fair enough. It seems to kind of fall in line with that verse, but do we believe that the prophet actually said this? It's not about whether it's nice, sounds nice, feels nice. Did he actually say it, right? Or about this other one that you may have heard as well, that my companions are like the stars in the sky. Whichever one you follow, you shall be guided. And you may have heard that one quite often as well, right? So the first one, like Matthew, you might say, has no chain. In other words, it has no way of validating it at all. It's just turned up at some point and people started passing it on. Yeah. Now, can you see how we wouldn't really be happy with that? We don't want what happened to Isa alayhi salam to happen to our prophet, where people start attributing anything they feel like to him. Yeah. There has to be some way of validating what he said. The companions are like the stars in the sky. It has chains. That hadith has chains, but it has a gentleman in the chain who's basically been called a liar. He just makes up stuff, basically. So that hadith is also considered to be fabricated. So you can see that essentially, we have to have, for us to have that certainty that we can know who the prophet was, know what he said, know what he did, know what the environment around him was like. We have to have some kind of assurance of the stories and the sayings around him, which are hadith. Hadith literally means a story, right? So somebody comes to you with a story, you think this sounds a little bit fantastical. You're going to want to say, well, where'd you get that from? And then they'll say, oh, I heard it from so-and-so. And you'll think, well, who is so-and-so? What was he like? Do I know him? Do I trust him? Do I trust you? You're telling me, do I trust you? Do I trust the person that got it? What's his memory like? Did other people see it as well? Do you see, you get this kind of, you want to ask lots of questions to assure yourself in your heart that what you've heard is true. So now let's go back to this question of, well, okay, in Bukhari, lots of stuff is written down about the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. When was the first written record of the sayings of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam? Okay, we have 4 questions here, and I'm going to put these questions to you, and hopefully we can do a poll on this. Hannah set it up. So if you could just fire off this poll for me, and let's see what you come up with. I'll give you a couple of minutes to do that. Right. Okay. So the kind of the most popular answer is Imam Bukhari. 9 out of 24 people who have voted, 38%. Oh, 10 out of 25. Right, 40% saying Imam Bukhari. Okay, the next down on the poll are the ones who voted for the companions. That's a bit of a bold assertion that the companions themselves first started writing down hadith. And next after that, the era of the followers, and then somewhere between A and B. Okay, right, excellent. So, we've got 36 now. Was that right? Okay, yeah. But anyway, the kind of the ranking stays the same. We'll find out. Okay, we will see. Let's start by contrasting what happened in the early years, and this is really important. See, fundamentally, what is a muhaddith? A muhaddith is a historian, and actually an objective historian, to the point that you will find often that the muhaddithun would take a story about the Prophet from people who they maybe didn't even agree with the creed of, like, let's say, a Shia, for instance, okay? But if they knew that this person had a good memory and they were, honest people, even if they had different political opinions or different kind of, slightly different kind of understandings of their religion, but they're objectively kind of essentially scientists. They were looking for evidence, they're looking for information, data, and evaluating the evidence of that data. Okay, that's basically what they did. So we have to delve into the story of what happened in the early days, and look at maybe a contrast between that and Christianity, to see how we can reassure ourselves that what we have is valid, essentially. Okay. So what you find in the early days of Christianity is that, quite early on, there were vast differences in the understanding of Christians. And in fact, what we have left are the writings of primarily Pauline Christians. These are Christians who followed Paul, and it's not the Jewish Christians. They originally did not follow Paul. Then later they started following Paul. So there were kind of quite vast differences amongst Christians, and to be honest, they had their own. Each of them had their own writings, and they were quite vastly different understandings of Jesus as well. The other thing is that Jesus's followers remained a minority and a somewhat sort of persecuted and obscure group. So it's not like their writings were widespread and easily accessible to everyone, that they could all say, oh, well, this is it. We've all got it. What you're coming with sounds very different to what everyone else knows, sort of thing. It was always something small, secret, hidden away and passed quietly from one person to the next. So there you can easily get you get room for distorted stories being secretly whispered from one to the other. Right. And they were persecuted by the emperors of the time, the Romans, because Christianity originated in the Roman Empire and it spread in the Roman Empire, but it was always kept under wraps, so that the early leaders of Christianity, Paul, Peter, were all executed by the Romans. Then loads of Jews were executed in AD 66 during the sacking of Jerusalem. And essentially, it was more or less the death knell of Jewish Christianity as well. So you can see that it was easy for an obscure teaching to become more and more obscure and to morph in its understanding, right? However, the contrast of that is Islam, where the Prophet ﷺ, had a massive multitude of followers, and it became the dominant religion in the peninsula of Arabia, so that you couldn't suddenly make up a completely different understanding of the Prophet, because everyone's already following him, and everyone knows. This is why Imam Malik said that the way of Medina is the way of the Prophet, because everyone here has been taught by the Prophet and followed his way from the beginning, at the time of the Prophet, you see. So even if things weren't written down formally, or the book's not here now, that within a couple of generations, there isn't going to be a massive distortion in what was said or did or taught about the Prophet, okay? Now, the other thing was that in the early years, the people in authority were pious people. For the first 30 years, when often, religion is finding its feet, the people in authority were pious people who knew the Prophet very, very well. They were his earliest followers. So they were going to be exceptionally careful about ensuring that the teachings of the religion are preserved, right? And not only just those 4 people, but whenever governors were sent out, from the outset, the Prophet ﷺ would send governors who knew their religion well, so that Islam, as it spread into all the nooks and crannies of the kind of, Arabian Peninsula first, then the rest of the kind of, you might say, Islamic Empire, the Khilafah, were people who knew their religion, would ensure that that teaching, that understanding, is the one that was passed out to the masses, right? So you find that the mainstream understanding of Islam, Sunni Islam, within decades, had reached every nook and cranny of this vast empire, okay, vast land, and anyone that was taught about the religion from a young age would be talking about exactly the same religion if they traveled, if they were in, Bukhara, all the way over in Central Asia, on the borders of China, pretty much, right? Literally, okay, to someone all the way on the other side in Spain, right? They still had the same understanding. They read the same Quran, but they knew the same prophet as well. Yeah. And of course, because of these teachings being held by people who, the custodians of these teachings were people who were very pious. So they were people who were anxious that the same thing that happened in Christianity did not happen in Islam, that the letter of not only the law of the Prophet ﷺ, but also the words of the Prophet were carefully transmitted, right? That became the tradition from an early time. So the kind of feeling of like, oh, sounds good, sounds like the Prophet, oh, this is lovely, I'll accept it and I'll pass it on, right? Amongst the people who are particularly knowledgeable and fastidious in their faith, the ulama, the scholars, that kind of practice was not accepted. I mean, there were lots of people that did have that approach, but these are the people that would not have been followed by the great Imams and the men of there were ranks of scholars. So the ones at the top were the ones that are ultra careful, and then the ones that and then you've got people who maybe were a little bit more lax in what they were willing to accept and to teach, right? Okay. Whereas, what we have with the Gospels, I mean, I don't think we should even talk about the Gospel of John, but the Synoptic Gospels are essentially 3 books of sayings of the Prophet and doings, the seerah of Prophet Isa, and they're like 3 separate collections, but without any chain of authority. And so you don't know where it came from. And essentially, people did use some source, we know, but the source is all mystery. It's all clouded in mystery and uncertainty. So you can see that there's a massive contrast in that respect. Now, in Islam, what happened is that, okay, after the Khulafa Rashidun, many of the Khalifs after that, the Umayyad case, but also the Abbasis after, but that's quite a bit later. The first 100 years was the Umayyads, pretty much 90 years, whatever. A lot of them are very lax, but they more or less left the Muhaddithun alone. The Hadith, the scholars of Hadith, these are the historians, the pious people, but also the people who are very interested in the stories around the Prophet and preserving them, right? So they're the Muhaddithun, okay? So they kept their distance from the caliphs, and the caliphs more or less kept themselves apart from these guys as well. I mean, occasionally there'd be a kind of kerfuffle between them, but often they're left at peace. We know about Imam Malik, who kind of essentially got involved by criticizing the policy of the governor of Medina, and then he was flogged. But that's a story we've covered. Okay, but by and large they were left alone, so it means that they could carry on teaching. Now, the next thing that's really important is that from the very beginning, Islam popularized writing, reading and writing. Okay, the importance of the written word. Yeah. اقرأ باسم ربك الذي خلق خلق الإنسان من علق اقرأ وربك الأكرم الذي علم بالقلم. That recite in the name of your Lord who created, and then in the end, الذي علم, the one who taught with the pen. This the importance that the very first verses are about the pen. So this was understood. And in Quraysh, in the Jahili times, there were only 17 people that could read or write in Mecca, in the entire city. But then, you know, in Medina, most of the scholars, the companions would have been able to read and write. They would have all learnt it. Okay, and the Prophet put great emphasis on teaching literacy to the companions, to his people, to Muslims, right? And you know about we know about that. I'm not going to go into details of that. But what it meant is that now the companions had the wherewithals to preserve the teachings of the Prophet ﷺ, his words. And we know that there is an account where the Prophet discouraged writing down his hadith, because and that's in the early days, because he wanted people to concentrate on preserving the Quran. Okay, but this is the answer to that earlier quiz, right? That many companions wrote some hadith down, and these are called suhuf. So it just means like a little, you know, collection, small collection, like suhuf Ibrahim wa Musa. So the Sahifa Sadiqa, which is about 1,000 hadith actually, was written by Abdullah ibn Amr ibn al-As, a very, very pious and careful companion of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu, who specifically asked the Prophet for permission to write down his sayings, and was given that permission. And then the Tabi'un, who are the followers of the disciples of the companions, you might say. So there were many collections of the Tabi'un as well. 48 are on record of the Tabi'un having written down hadith. Okay. You might say, oh yeah, all right, okay, it's all very well saying that, just plucking these numbers out of the sky, and you know, but these are recorded in the books. You know, there's many books and volumes about the lives of the various tabi'un and companions, and you know, the Tabaqat of Ibn Sa'ad is a massive collection of the stories of these people. And it's mentioned in there that they clearly about that they wrote these things. Okay, but you say, well, okay, it's all very well saying that, but they're not here today. Well, actually, there is a copy of the Sahifa of Hammam ibn Munabbih. Now, it's a copy; it's not the original, but there are actually two copies in a couple of museums around the world. One in Damascus, one in Berlin, in the old libraries of these cities. And the Hammam ibn Munabbih was a student of Abu Huraira. So Abu Huraira basically dictated. He had a number of students, and Hammam ibn Munabbih dictated all the hadith of Abu Huraira, and that's he himself was illiterate, and that's available. That's actually available to study, to compare, but not the original. It won't be an original. These were copies of the original. Now, okay, many of the Sahifa don't exist anymore, but you have to understand why. Think about it, right? It makes sense. It's just obvious if you think about what would naturally happen to a Sahifa, okay? Because a Sahifa is a small collection of a few hadith, right? So let's give the example of Hammam ibn Munabbih. This is a student who sat at the feet of Abu Huraira, okay? So all he writes down are the hadith he gets from Abu Huraira, okay? And we know that the companions would have had flocks of students, okay? And then those students would have students, etc. And that's how it went down, okay? So he writes his book about all the hadith of Abu Huraira. Now, the next generation, you will have traveling students, right? Most of the really well-known and erudite scholars traveled. Why did they travel? In search of knowledge. So somebody comes to Hammam ibn Munabbih and says, give me your hadith, please, right? So Hammam ibn Munabbih says, okay, you've got to memorize them. He memorizes them, and then he copies them down to make sure that he's got his memorizations absolutely sound, and that he can then give this copy to others. But what he would then do is go to someone else, add what they've written about the Prophet ﷺ as well into his compendium. So the compendium gets bigger and has more hadith in it. What's he going to do then? He's not going to then keep a separate scrap of this is Hammam ibn Munabbih's Sahifa. He's just going to say, okay, well, these are the hadith I got from Hammam ibn Munabbih, but he might separate it by topic, or he might separate it by hadith of Hammam ibn Munabbih, and these are the hadith of so-and-so, right? Or it will actually be, he'd probably compile them and say, hadith from Abu Huraira, and these are the hadith. Hadith from Abu Huraira from Hammam ibn Munabbih, hadith from Abu Huraira from so-and-so, another student of Abu Huraira's, right? And he'll put them all together. That's called a musnad. And then he'll have the hadith of Aisha and the hadith of so-and-so, right? So you get a slightly bigger book. And then the next student of his would spend even more time, because now that someone's done the collecting, there's less work for the next person to do. They can get a bigger book, right? Until eventually, 3 generations down, you end up with Imam Ahmad bin Hanbal, who's actually the teacher of Imam Bukhari. So, you know, that even tells you that straight away. Imam Bukhari's collection was not the first collection. Can't be, because we've got Musnad of Ahmad. And this is a massive book, way bigger than Imam Bukhari's book, 30,000 hadith. And it's a musnad. So he puts the hadith according to the companion, and then all the chains, the different people that studied under those companions. You see, and so what happens to those original scraps? Nobody's going to, you know, first of all, they're probably on sort of very small little fragments of paper or whatever, probably not paper initially, but other bits of, you know, bone and leather, etc. So they get lost. They basically just fall apart. Okay, and then. And also they're just small. They're not, you know, when you've got a little collection of Munabbis, why would you bother just looking at that when you've got the Musnad of Ahmad with everything in it from all the different people, you know, the sum totality of hadith that Imam Ahmad could reasonably rely upon. Wow, you know, and it's huge, 30,000 hadith. So you can see that the Sahifas would perish in time, you know. Okay. Question about access to the notes, and yes, inshallah, I'll pass it out. Okay. The Prophet ﷺ prioritized the teachings. Okay, because oh, hang on, one other point before that was just to mention that, for instance, Umar bin Abdulaziz was, like, you know, thought of as the 5th rightly guided Khalif. He was keen to preserve the deen as well, and so actually instructed people to write down hadith as well. So formally gave them a salary that, you know, here's I'm commissioning the work of you writing down a big collection of hadith. So Abu Bakr ibn Hazm's one of the famous people that was from Medina that was asked to do that. And that's quite early on, you see. So he was born 62 Hijrah, which is only 52 years after the Prophet passed away. Okay. Then the Prophet himself, the Prophet would teach students. There were some people who were very poor, and they decided that just dedicate their life to learning from the Prophet. These are Ahl al-Sufa. These are people who were basically put on a platform on the side of the mosque, and they spent their days and nights there. And people would just basically feed them, and they would spend their time being taught, you know, the totality of knowledge, you might say, from the Prophet. So you think, you know, Abu Huraira, who's, like, you know, didn't come to Islam very early, not known for very much else, but wow, how did he manage to know so many hadith? Well, he was probably the most prominent companion of Ahl Sufa. So that's why he learned. He was sat there saying, other people had businesses, etc. They had lives, and he was there. I just want to be at your feet, Ya Rasulullah, and learn from you. And so the Prophet would actually teach them, right? And the people with better memories are the ones who then went on to teach others. Then there are lots of instances, they're in the notes, and I'm not going to go through them just now, but there are instances of where the companions themselves would sometimes not take it. To the point where there's a story there of Fatima radiallahu anha doing something that Ali didn't approve of, but he said, why are you doing this? And she said, oh, the Prophet said I should do it. And he didn't even believe her. He went back to the Prophet and said, is it really true that you said to Fatima? Yeah. So there's this, and it wasn't a big deal. Companions would do that frequently to corroborate what was said. And so there was that tradition from the outset of being careful or being sure about what you've heard. All right. So this was part of the tradition. And initially there weren't chains, like formal chains, because if you think about it, at the time of the companions, when a companion said, the Prophet has said this, they would have been hearing it from, if they didn't hear it directly from the Prophet, they'd have heard it from another companion, who'd have heard it from another companion, who might have heard it from another companion. But, if these are all people of, sharp intellect, they're all pious, and they had good memories, then it would just be accepted. So, a companion could just say, from the Prophet who said, da, 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 right? Some hadith, though, say, I heard the Prophet say. Right, those are the best hadith. They're absolutely, more reliable in that respect. But still, you can understand how that happens. And the same happens for the students of the companions. So, for instance, if a student of a companion says, the Prophet said such and such, and clearly, if they're well known to be a student of companions, you know that he's not making it up. He got it from the Prophet. So this is called a Morsel hadith. We have an example of Hassan al-Basri, who's a tabi, who's a student of the companions. And he said that if 4 companions agreed on a hadith, they all said the same thing about, then the person, the tabi, the disciple of the companions, wouldn't, he's heard it from so many different sources, he wouldn't bother quoting which companion he heard it from. He would just say that the Prophet said this, because it's just corroborated from so many different people. Do you see? So you had a lot of Morsel hadith being used in the early days. So Imam Malik from the early days used a lot of Morsel hadith. 600 of his hadith are musnad. That means they've got the full chain going back to the Prophet, but 222 are Morsel, where he's just said from Tabi, a disciple of the companions, that the Prophet said. There's a missing link, but the missing link is a companion. Yeah. So there wasn't that kind of, but then after that, it became more important for people to be rigorous, and then they wanted the full chain, particularly at from the time of the big fitna, which is the conflict between Ali and Muawiyah. Then people started to sort of make up hadith in support of one party or the other, and then they started to ask for, well, exactly who did you hear it from? I want to know who you heard it from, because I need to know who that person was, what their story is. Okay. And then eventually you got to the point where people, realize that the isnad, as this is called. So you've got hadith have 2 parts. They have the content of the hadith called the Mutton, and then they have the sanad, the chain, or the isnad. And so the knowing the chain became very important. So this evolved into a phenomenal science of, scientifically corroborating the validity of each hadith, right? So once you know the chain and you know that each person is reliable in that chain to the last person, then you know that you can trust that the Prophet actually did say this, right? Then you can look at, well, okay, are there other chains that are completely independent? And that gives you even more corroboration. You see, and this is how the whole system of validating hadith came along. So there were people making up, and that's the whole reason it happened, is because there were made up hadith. And we've looked at some already, right? It's not that all hadith are valid, right? But the whole reason that hadith are being validated is because people were making hadith up, okay? And then in the end, Abdullah ibn Mubarak says, who's a teacher of Imam Bukhari, he says that isnad is part of the religion. The religion cannot be separated from this system of isnad. You know, had it not been for the isnad, then whoever wished would have said whatever he wished, whatever he liked. Yeah, people would say anything about the Prophet. Okay. And Nabi Abbott, and we're going to talk about Nabi Abbott later, but she mentions that deliberate tampering with either the content or the isnads of the Prophet's tradition may have passed undetected by ordinary transmitters, but not by the aggregate of the ever-watchful, basically honest, and aggressively outspoken master traditionists and hadith critics. So, you know, you have grades of everything, but at the top, you've got people who are the professors, right, of the history of the Prophet, you might say, right? And these are the master muhaddithun, to the point that people were careful about choosing their teachers, you know. So the Prophet's mosque had countless teachers in it of all grades and qualities. But, you know, out of 70 people teaching in the Prophet's mosque at the time, Imam Malik only learned from a handful of those, because they're the ones he could truly rely upon as being very careful with the quality of hadith. Yeah. So the people that we get our hadith books from, and particularly Bukhari and Muslim, and also the Muwatta Imam Malik as well, these people were very careful. And to be honest, Imam Ahmad as well, because he knew which was more authentic and which was less. So these people were very careful in the exact wording. And you see, to the point that when companions were teaching their students, imagine that if you're a student of knowledge, you're a student of hadith, you're going to dedicate, let's say, 2 years in learning from somebody. What are you doing in those 2 years? You are going to learn word for word every hadith, word for word precisely. And then the person that's taught you will check, and they'll have their own written record, and they will check your memory against their written record as well. Do you see? So there's a double corroboration there, the written and the memory. And then he says, right, okay, I now give you permission to go off and teach this stuff. Yeah. This is the nature of the way that the hadith were collected from very early on. And then, you know, the hadith books were then aggregated. So Imam Ahmad had, it is thought, access to 750,000 hadith. Well, each hadith, if it's the same thing that the Prophet said, but it's different chains, then that becomes a different hadith, right? So it doesn't mean 750 different sayings of the Prophet. There could be, you know, not 750,000. There could be, out of that, there could be maybe 300,000 sayings, or not, probably less than that, 100,000 sayings of the Prophet, but they're all different chains, or probably less than that, actually. Yeah. We've talked about the memorization of students. So the hadith scholars, we've talked about how they stayed independent of the people of authority. So there were scholars, of course, that were connected to governments, and some of them were known to toe the official line, even make hadith up in support of the government. But we're talking about the people who are, you know, the really careful scholars, and they're the ones that people respected. They're the ones who then became known to posterity, and they were independent always of governments. You know, some of them got into trouble with governments as well, and we know about that. We've talked about that last time as well. Imam Shafi'i, Imam Malik as well. Okay. Now, so I'm going to just finish very quickly with this understanding of, well, okay, the hadith chain system. There is, so we've talked about the idea of a chain, okay? I heard from so-and-so who heard from so-and-so. Sometimes the slightly less strict chain would be from so-and-so, from so-and-so. But I heard, sami'tu, I heard from so-and-so who heard from so-and-so is very precise. And that shows someone who's being extremely precise in what they're collecting, okay? But then you need to know, well, who are these people? So you had, there was a science of knowing about the people called ilm al-rijal. And there are massive volumes of the stories of the people in these chains. So you will know, for instance, of each of the people in the chains, their life story, who they studied from, when they were born, when they were in this city, when they were in that city. So you can check the chains against, if they say, oh, I learned from so-and-so, and you think, well, hang on a second, they were in different eras, and you can't have had a hadith where he learned from so-and-so, because they actually never met. They're never in the same city together, or he died before he was born. Do you see what I mean? Once you know the full detailed narrative, and these scholars made tremendous effort to document the precise details, but also including their character as well. So there's a sub-branch of Ilm al-Rijal called Ilm al-Jarh wa Ta'dil, which is the science of disparaging or authenticating. And this is where you take all the stories of that person and come to conclusions. And you could say, oh, well, this is backbiting, but it's for a particular reason. It's for preserving the life of the Prophet, right? So you could say about this person, and there's grades there, that you're talking about the quality of their memory, you're talking about the quality of their character and their piety as well, okay, and their intelligence and their understanding of the religion, how much of the Quran they knew, etc., right? To the point that finally you would make a grading on the narrator themselves, so that you would actually say they're an Imam or a Hafidh, which means that this is someone who has a precise knowledge of the Hadith, okay, or someone who's reliable, trustworthy, to the point where, you say abandoned, we don't use him for Hadith, or a fabricator, right? This guy is notorious. You cannot take his Hadith because they're just made up. He makes them up left, right, and center. Okay. And then finally, just the last thing to finish on now is that as a consequence of this, the scholars of Hadith then would qualify their analysis of the Hadith with a final verdict. And we're all aware of how they came to this verdict. So or what the verdicts are. So you have Sahay, which means completely authentic. Now, bear in mind that there are lots of scholars of Hadith, and they would somehow have different opinions on different Hadith. But generally, when a scholar says it's Sahay, and if they're really a scholar of extreme meticulous precision, and they say it's Sahay, then you can rely upon it, right? Then you have Hasan, which is like pretty good, but it may not be exactly precisely what the Prophet said. Then you have Da'if, and Da'if means that it's got weaknesses in it. The Prophet may have said something like this, possibly, may not be what the Prophet actually said. There's something that's not quite there with this, okay? So some Da'if hadith may be acceptable to follow, possibly. Imam Ahmad used to think so, with some of the Da'if hadith he had. And some would get very close to, well, I really am not sure, I think this could be fabricated, and that you might stay away from. And the next level down is Mawdu', which means fabricated. It's evidently fabricated. So if a hadith's got no chain, or if it's got a person in the chain who's notorious, that's Mawdu'. Okay, so almost finished now. Next thing is just to so you've got that grade. One thing to mention above Sahih, right? The next thing above Sahih is Mutawatir. Now, once you've got something that's Mutawatir, you can really rely upon this. Mutawatir is basically like the Quran is Mutawatir. Mutawatir is so many different really good chains, very, very, very sound Sahih chains, said so many times completely independently. For instance, the hadith of the Prophet ﷺ, whoever fabricates against me intentionally, let him take his seat in the hellfire, right? That hadith has got 62 different companions narrating that hadith, and they've got their own chains coming down, right? So many companions have heard that Prophet say that, and their students, and their students, their students, that we know the Prophet ﷺ definitely said that. You see, so that's mutawatir, that's the next level up. Okay, so this was basically a kind of little journey into how we ended up with our hadith hadith books. Okay, but one thing that's really important to know is that the writing down of hadith started very early, and with it a careful memorization, and the students of the people of knowledge were there from the very beginning. Remember that. okay, that the companions held the knowledge of the Prophet, and then people that love the Prophet flocked to these companions and stayed with them until they'd memorized what the companions had taught them. Okay. Now I just want to finish with this little diagram that we saw before of the tradition of knowledge. Okay, so you have at the top you had the Prophet, then he taught the companions. The companions, I haven't put the companions here. The companions had disciples, the Tabi'un, and those disciples had disciples. Now their disciples were people like Imam Malik. Okay, so you can imagine Imam Malik isn't that far away from the Prophet ﷺ, and he wrote the Muwatta, and the Muwatta is a collection of hadith as well as other things, right? His student was Imam Shafi'i, who, remember, talked about the importance of using hadith for sunnah. And then his student was Imam Ahmad bin Hanbal, who was the master collector of hadith. Okay, 30,000 hadith in the Musnad, which is still here today. Now, the student of Imam Ahmad bin Hanbal was Imam Bukhari. Now, it's not like he was this dedicated student alone. Imam Bukhari had lots of scholars that he learned from, but one of his scholars that he learned from was Imam Bukhari. So this is where Imam Bukhari comes in that chain of transmission, you know, that he learned from very, very great people, mashallah. And we will learn a little bit more about Imam Bukhari next time, and we'll see why we can rely upon the hadith of Imam Bukhari, what he did, his efforts in trying to authenticate. He wasn't alone, no doubt, and we'll talk about that another time. But you know, he is an example of someone who tried extremely hard to very carefully preserve the truth of what the Prophet ﷺ said, before, you know, it may get lost into the vicissitudes of time. So I'm just going to end there, and I'm just going to pass on to Sister Sarah to mention about the next masterclass, inshallah. Subhanakallahumma bihamdik, ashhadu an la ilaha illa anta, astaghfiruka wa atubu ilayk. A'udhu billahi minash shaitanir rajim. Bismillahir rahmanir rahim. Wal asr, innal insana lafi khusr illa alladhina amanu wa 'amilus salihati wa tawasaw bil haqqi wa tawasaw bis sabr. سبحان ربك رب العزة عما يصفون وسلام على المرسلين والحمد لله رب العالمين. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله.